The fellowship had broken apart in the shadow of the hill, and the cries of battle still echoed faintly behind them when rough hands seized Merry and Pippin. Orcs swarmed from the trees, their black mail clinking like chains in the wind. One of the larger creatures, its face a mask of scars and yellow fangs, hoisted Pippin under one arm as if he weighed no more than a sack of roots. Merry struggled, kicking at the shins of his captor, but a blow across the back of his head left him dazed and gasping. They were bound quickly with coarse ropes that bit into their wrists. The orcs wasted no words on their prizes, only grunts and harsh laughter as they slung the hobbits over their shoulders and turned south along the riverbank. Merry tasted blood in his mouth and felt the world tilt with every jolting step. Pippin called out once, a thin sound that was swallowed by the trees. No answer came from the scattered companions they had left behind. The band moved fast, faster than any band of men could have managed on such ground. The orcs were tireless, their legs thick with muscle from endless marches. They spoke in their own tongue, a grating language that made the hobbits' ears ache. From snatches of common speech that slipped through, Merry gathered they were Uruk-hai, bred for war in the pits of Isengard. Their leader, a brute called Ugluk, kept them in line with curses and the flat of his blade. Night fell, and still they did not rest. The hobbits were dropped to the earth only long enough for a gulp of foul water and a crust of bread that tasted of ash. Pippin whispered to Merry when the guards turned their backs.
"We must find a way free. They mean to take us to their master."
Merry nodded, though his head throbbed. He worked at the knots with numb fingers whenever the orcs looked away. One length of rope gave a little, enough that he could flex his wrists and feel blood return. The forest thickened around them, the air growing heavy with the scent of moss and old leaves. Strange birds called in the dark, and the orcs muttered uneasily, quickening their pace. By the second day, the company reached the edge of a denser wood. Here the trees stood taller and closer together, their trunks wrapped in shadow even at midday. Ugluk ordered a brief halt. The orcs argued among themselves, some eager to press on, others wary of the silent boughs ahead. While they quarreled, Merry managed to loosen Pippin's bonds as well. They waited, hearts pounding, for the moment when attention shifted. It came when a scout returned with news of riders in the distance. The orcs surged forward in sudden panic, shoving the hobbits ahead of them. In the confusion, Merry twisted free, grabbed Pippin's arm, and they bolted toward the nearest thicket. Shouts rose behind them. Arrows hissed through the air, one grazing Merry's sleeve. They plunged deeper into the trees, branches whipping their faces, roots tripping their feet. The forest swallowed sound. The orcs' pursuit grew ragged as the undergrowth tangled their heavier limbs. Merry and Pippin ran until their lungs burned, then stumbled on at a staggering walk. The trees here were ancient and watchful, their leaves stirring without wind. A low mist clung to the ground, muffling their steps. They did not stop until the last orc cry faded behind them. Panting, they leaned against a broad trunk whose bark felt warm beneath their hands. Pippin wiped sweat from his brow.
"We are in Fangorn,"
He said softly.
"The old stories say the trees move when strangers walk these paths."
Merry looked back the way they had come. No pursuit showed itself, only the dim green light filtering through layered branches. He loosened the last of the ropes from his wrists and let them fall.
"Then let them move if they will. Better the forest than the orcs' knives."
They pressed onward, choosing paths that seemed to open before them. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint scent of running water. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time felt uncertain beneath the canopy. At length they reached a small clearing, where a stream trickled over smooth stones. They drank and rested, listening to the quiet that was not quite silence. Far behind them, the orcs had turned back. Their mission failed. Ahead lay only the deepening wood, its secrets folded into every root and leaf. Merry and Pippin rose again and walked on, two small figures vanishing into the green heart of Fangorn as twilight gathered overhead. Merry and Pippin pressed deeper into the wood as the last light faded from the canopy above. The air grew thick with the scent of moss and old bark, and every step seemed to stir something just beyond their sight. They had walked for what felt like hours when a low rumble reached their ears, like wind moving through hollow roots. Pippin stopped first, clutching Merry's arm. Ahead stood what looked like a great tree, yet it shifted and turned its head, with eyes like deep pools of water under heavy brows. The figure regarded them slowly, its limbs creaking as it bent forward.
Hum.
It said at last, the voice deep and measured.
Little folk in Fangorn. Not seen such in many long years. What brings you here, with orc scent clinging to your clothes?
Merry found his voice first, and told of their capture, the escape, and the darkness that had driven them into the forest. Treebeard listened without hurry, his great hands resting on a staff that might once have been a branch from some forgotten oak. When the tale reached Saruman and the fires of Isengard, the Ents' eyes narrowed.
Saruman.
He rumbled.
Once a friend to the trees, now he fells and burns and digs with iron claws. The forest weeps, yet we have slept too long.
They walked beside him as twilight gave way to night. Treebeard moved with deliberate grace, each stride covering ground that took the hobbits many steps. He spoke of the Entwives lost long ago, of the slow wisdom of the trees, and of the dangers that now pressed against the borders of his realm. Merry and Pippin listened, awed by the weight of ages in every word. When they reached a clearing where starlight filtered through gaps in the leaves, Treebeard halted and lifted his voice in a chord that echoed like distant thunder. Other shapes answered from the shadows. Tall figures emerged, some gnarled like ancient pines, others broad as beeches, all moving with the same unhurried purpose. An Entmoot began under the boughs, voices rising and falling in measured cadence that stretched through the night. Merry and Pippin sat nearby, weary but unable to sleep, as the shepherds of the trees debated the fate of Isengard. Treebeard translated now and then, explaining how Saruman's machines had poisoned the waters and how the time for watching had ended. By dawn, the decision was made. The Ents stirred as one, their limbs stretching and creaking into motion. Roots pulled free from the soil with sounds like tearing cloth, and the ground trembled beneath them. Merry and Pippin climbed onto Treebeard's shoulders for the march, the forest itself seeming to awaken around them. Huorns followed in their wake, dark masses of moving wood that needed no urging. The column wound through the trees toward the plains beyond, a living tide of bark and branch, bent on ending the threat from the White Tower. As they crossed the last ridge, the towers of Isengard came into view, smoke rising from its pits. Treebeard raised his staff, and the Ents answered with a roar that shook the air. The march had begun, and the forest would not rest until the damage was undone. The column wound through the trees toward the plains beyond, a living tide of bark and branch bent on ending the threat from the White Tower. Yet far from that growing fury, Aragorn and his companions pressed on through the broken lands east of the mountains. Their path had grown weary with each step, the ground rising in jagged ridges that offered little shelter. Legolas moved with the quiet grace of his people, eyes scanning the horizon, while Gimli muttered under his breath about the endless stones. Aragorn led them steadily, his hand never far from his sword, for the air carried whispers of distant strife. A figure emerged from the morning mist, tall and cloaked in white, that seemed to catch the light like fresh snow on the peaks. Gandalf stood before them, no longer the grey wanderer they had known, but transformed. His beard gleamed, and his staff shone with an inner fire. The companions halted, hearts quickening at the sight.
It is I, Gandalf the White.
He said, voice steady and clear. I have passed through shadow and flame and returned with purpose renewed. Aragorn stepped forward first, relief mingling with wonder on his face. They spoke of the wizard's fall and rise, of battles unseen and powers awakened in the deep places of the earth. Gandalf listened to their tales in turn, nodding at each detail of the Ents' march and the shadow creeping over Rohan.
The road ahead lies heavy with peril.
He continued after a moment's pause. Rohan stands besieged, its people scattered like leaves before the storm. We must ride to their aid before the darkness claims the golden halls. They gathered what strength remained and mounted the swift horses that Gandalf summoned from hidden glens. The land unfolded before them, rolling hills giving way to open plains where wind stirred the tall grasses. As they traveled, Gandalf spoke of hope amid ruin. The enemy believes victory certain, yet the hearts of free folk burn brighter than before. Legolas asked of the Ents and their ancient grudge, and Gandalf smiled faintly, noting that the forest's wrath would shake Isengard to its roots. Gimli grumbled about wizards and their riddles, but gripped his axe tighter, ready for whatever waited at the end of the ride. Aragorn remained silent for long stretches, his thoughts turning to the King of Rohan and the duty that bound them all. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across their path. Gandalf urged them onward with words that stirred courage in tired limbs. They crossed streams swollen from recent rains and skirted forests where birds fell silent at their approach. News reached them on the wind of riders fleeing south, their banners torn and their voices hoarse from warning cries. Rohan called for aid, and Gandalf answered with the fire of old. Night fell as they neared the first outposts, the horizon flickering with the distant glow of watchfires. Gandalf halted them on a low hill, his eyes turning westward toward the besieged lands. The wizard's presence filled the air with quiet command, a beacon against the gathering dark. Aragorn felt the weight of leadership settle once more, yet it no longer pressed alone. Together they would turn the tide, guiding the scattered forces of Rohan toward a stand that might yet preserve the realm. Dawn broke with the promise of battle, the companions riding hard into the heart of the storm. Gandalf led without hesitation, his white robes billowing like a banner of renewal. The plains stretched endless, but each stride brought them closer to the Golden Hall and the fate that awaited within its walls. Gandalf, guiding the scattered forces of Rohan toward a stand that might yet preserve the realm, pressed onward as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. The companions rode hard into the heart of the storm, their horses straining across the open plains. Gandalf led without hesitation, his white robes billowing like a banner of renewal. The plains stretched endless, but each stride brought them closer to the Golden Hall and the fate that awaited within its walls. They reached the ancient fortress of Helm's Deep as the sun climbed higher, its sheer cliffs rising like a wall against the coming tide. Theoden's riders poured through the gates, weary yet resolved, while Aragorn and his friends dismounted amid the clamour of preparation. Legolas strung his bow in silence, and Gimli checked the edge of his axe with a grim nod. Inside the deep, the air hummed with tension as men hauled barrels of arrows to the battlements and braced the great doors with timber. The wizard turned to Theoden, his voice steady amid the gathering storm.
The hour is upon us. Saruman's host will not wait for nightfall.
The king, his face lined with years of strife, gave the order to man the walls. Defenders climbed the steep steps, their shields glinting in the morning light. From the heights, the valley below began to fill with movement, dark shapes massing like thunderclouds on the distant road. The first horns echoed from the enemy lines, deep and menacing, as the Uruk-hai advanced in ordered ranks. Their armor clanked, and their pikes formed a forest of steel. Arrows soon rained down, hissing through the air like angry wasps. The men of Rohan answered with volleys of their own, thinning the front ranks, but barely slowing the surge. Below, ladders rose against the outer wall, clawed hands reaching for the parapets. Aragorn fought at the forefront, his sword flashing as he cut down climbers who gained the top. Gimli stood beside him, swinging his axe in heavy arcs that sent foes tumbling back into the press below. Legolas loosed shaft after shaft, each finding its mark with deadly precision amid the chaos. The defenders held the line for a time, but the enemy numbers swelled without end, their chants rising to drown out the defenders' cries. A great blast shook the earth as Saruman's devices erupted against the wall, shattering stone and sending fragments flying. Dust clouded the air, and a breach opened in the defences. Theoden rallied his men with a shout, leading a charge to plug the gap before it widened beyond hope. Gandalf remained at the command post, his staff glowing faintly as he directed reserves to the weakest points. The battle raged on through the afternoon, the sun turning red as blood on the horizon. As night fell, the torches of the attackers lit the valley like a sea of fire. Yet the companions stood firm, their resolve unbroken even as fresh waves assaulted the inner defences. The fortress trembled under the weight of the siege, but within its heart the spark of resistance endured. Far from the raging battles at the fortress where torches burned like a sea of fire, Frodo and Sam crept onward through the dead marshes with Gollum slinking ahead like a shadow given life. The ground sucked at their boots with every step, releasing foul bubbles that burst with the stench of old death. Mist clung low and thick, hiding the pale lights that flickered beneath the water like lost stars. Gollum paused often, sniffing the air with his flat nose, his large eyes gleaming.
Not safe. No, not safe.
He muttered, more to himself than to them.
Orcs prowl these paths. Spies, too, with eyes like hawks.
Frodo felt the weight of the ring grow heavier under his shirt, a constant pull that made his steps drag. Sam stayed close, one hand on the hilt of his sword, watching their guide with open suspicion. They moved at dusk, when the marshes grew quiet save for the distant croak of unseen frogs. A patrol of orcs passed nearby, their harsh voices carrying over the reeds. Gollum dropped flat, gesturing frantically for the hobbits to do the same. They pressed into the mud as the orcs splashed past, blades drawn and grunting in some dark tongue. One paused, sniffing, but moved on after a tense moment. Frodo's heart pounded loud in his ears. Night brought no relief. The lights in the water brightened, drawing the eye with false promises of rest. Gollum led them around a wide pool where bones gleamed white under the surface.
Don't look, master.
He hissed.
They call, but we don't listen.
Sam muttered under his breath about the foulness of it all. Yet he kept pace, his loyalty unbroken. Frodo nodded, though weariness pulled at him like the mire itself. Spies lurked beyond the orcs. A lone figure in dark cloak watched from a distant ridge, its form blending with the rocks until it slipped away into the gloom. Gollum sensed it too, and quickened his pace, urging them through narrower trails where the water reached their knees. The air grew colder here, thick with whispers not their own. Frodo clutched at Sam's arm for balance as they waded, the ring seeming to tug towards some unseen danger ahead. By midnight they halted in a patch of drier ground ringed by twisted reeds. Gollum scouted ahead alone, while the hobbits shared a meager bite of lembas. Sam's eyes never left the surrounding mist.
I don't trust him, Mr. Frodo.
He said softly.
He's leading us into worse trouble, mark my words.
Frodo agreed in silence, knowing the truth of it, yet seeing no other path. The marshes stretched endless, full of treachery both seen and hidden. Gollum returned with news of a crossing, his voice eager and sly. They rose and followed once more, evading another orc band by hiding among the reeds until the sounds faded. The spies' presence lingered like a shadow at their backs, but they pressed forward, the ground firming slightly underfoot as they neared the marsh's edge. A faint path opened before them, leading into deeper night. A faint path opened before them, leading into deeper night. Yet the true march began elsewhere, where ancient voices stirred the trees into motion. Treebeard led the way, his long strides carrying the weight of centuries as the Ents roused from their slow thoughts. Beside him walked the hobbits, their small forms dwarfed by the towering figures, yet their hearts burned with the same fire for justice. The forest itself seemed to awaken, branches creaking like old bones as Huorns joined the host, their shadowy forms gliding forward in grim silence. The Ents sang their marching song, a deep, rolling chant that echoed through the woods and set the ground trembling. They spoke of Saruman's betrayals, of axes felling trees without mercy, of smoke and fire poisoning the air. Vengeance fueled their pace, slow at first, but gathering strength like a rising flood. Men from the scattered villages nearby heard the call and joined, farmers and woodsmen armed with whatever they could carry. Together they formed an unlikely alliance, Ents at the front with their massive limbs swinging, men following with torches and spears. As they neared Isengard, the tower of Orthanc loomed against the stars, its black stone cold and unyielding. Saruman's orcs patrolled the walls, unaware of the doom approaching from the trees. The Ents halted at the edge of the vale, their eyes glowing like embers. Treebeard raised his arms and gave the word, a single booming command that sent the Warns surging ahead. They crashed through the gates like a living avalanche, roots tearing stone and branches whipping down guards in a frenzy of green fury. The men charged behind them, shouting battle cries as they stormed the outer defenses. Orcs fell back in disarray, their arrows useless against the Ents' thick hides. Water from the river began to rise, diverted by the Ents' great hands that dammed and redirected the flow. Soon the valley filled, a flood of vengeance sweeping through workshops and forges, drowning the machines of war that Saruman had built. The tower stood defiant at first, but the waters lapped at its base, undermining the foundations with relentless pressure. Inside Orthanc, Saruman watched from his high window, his face pale with rage and fear. He called on his powers, sending bolts of fire and shadow downward, but the Ents pressed on, their songs drowning out his spells. One great Ent, older than most, reached the very walls and began to hammer with fists like boulders. Cracks spread across the stone, and the floodwaters poured in through every breach. Men fought alongside, cutting down the last pockets of resistance with grim determination. The destruction unfolded in waves. Forges hissed and exploded as water met molten metal. Pits filled with debris and the cries of the defeated. The Ents showed no mercy, for they had seen too many trees burned and too many friends lost to the wizard's greed. By dawn, the valley was a lake, with Orthanc rising like a lone island amid the wreckage. Saruman remained trapped within, his voice silent at last as the waters settled. The allies stood together on the higher ground, breathing the clean air of victory. The men nodded to the Ents in quiet respect, while Treebeard looked out over the flooded ruins with a sigh that carried both sorrow and resolve. The march had ended, but the forest would remember this day.